Hello, this is Branko Malic of Tribune. In this video, I'll attempt to answer to some of the comments of Tribune readers. Hopefully, I'll do this more often, because some of the comments are very poignant and very interesting, and I think that they direct in the good direction in the terms of development of problems we examine on Tribune. So without further ado, let us start. A new reader going by the nick Karlov has this to ask. We'll skip the pleasantries. And he says, I quote, "As much as you rightly lament the stupidity of the general population and also of those who subscribe to an alternative worldview, is there not emerging a highly dangerous discrepancy between the general understanding of what is technologically feasible in the manipulation of biological organisms and the utilization of space and the reality? Does this not constitute a form of hidden power that warrants serious investigation?" Yes, it does. It does form a power, but whether this power is hidden is another thing. Now, as for stupidity of general population, I don't remember myself saying that general population is stupid, although I can be always quoted as saying that masses cannot think, and maybe that was what I meant. Whereas when we're talking about this alternative worldview and alternative media, this is where I would apply the term stupidity. I would apply a much more sinister terms for what this alt media seems to be to me. Now, I presume that manipulation of biological organisms is along the lines of GMO. I do consider this to be extremely dangerous. I've wrote about it. Not at length in terms of GMO, but I've wrote a lot about posthumanism and regarding these emerging technologies that are really more like science fiction in terms of what is feasible. I wrote a lot on the subject of posthumanism. Now, I will quote further. Moreover, does this not pertain to issues of sustainable development? Yes, it does, to a large extent. In other words, the control of the numbers and characteristics of the global human population. Now, I presume that you mean that sustainable development is somehow necessarily connected with these attempts to re-engineer human being or not. I think there is no good evidence for this. This is when we are going in the field of what is usually called conspiracy theory. But if you want to point out the sinister nature of something like sustainable development or something like posthumanism, you don't need to go that far. I will recommend, first of all, an article by my associate Mihai Marinescu, which is going under the name Most Hideous Strength, Counter-Initiation and Subversive Politics in C.S. Lewis Imaginarium. Now, this is at first sight a review of the book by C.S. Lewis, book that Hideous Strength. But in fact, it is a rather long and detailed essay on the problem of this attempt to, as Lewis would say, abolish the man. And I warmly recommend reading this. This is one of the best articles we have on this subject. There are more. Most of those others written by me. But I would point out this Mihai's article because it has a unique perspective, and it's, to tell you the truth, the closest thing to what I myself think. The other thing is, when we are talking about sustainable development, I think that this is one of the subjects that do not exactly fit in the mold of conspiracy theory. It is pretty much a public policy. The public policy with intended global reach and sinister purpose. The main purpose being control of the numbers of human population. And to get to grips of sustainable development, all you need to do is to be patient enough to read documents by United Nations and some other supranational institutions or non-governmental bodies, one of those being Club of Rome, of which we'll speak shortly. Namely, I think that sustainable development is the focus of the whole range of policies that were developed in the West at the latest from the early 70s till now. And I do consider, for instance, climate change, or as it was called before, global warming, civil religion, that's how I would define it, to be one instance of this, and one very good example of how this mindset of total control, an attempt to have a model of the world that is completely and absolutely controllable, comes to pass. I will just recommend reading this. This is Climate of Fear in 2 parts, my article on global warming scare and the problem of sustainable development. And the crux of this article is in fact being based on a document, and this document is The Predicament of Mankind, the first programmatic document issued by Club of Rome. Club of Rome is, of course, a think tank, which is, in my opinion, quite irrelevant now, but at the time of publishing this document, that is 1970, it was rather important, at least as a think tank that inspired very influential circles, among others those that practically co-opted UN's politics and UN's environmental program and turn it into vehicle for what was in these times of Predicament of Mankind being called ecological balance to that what is now called sustainable development, or in third iteration, smart growth. Now, I'll tell you a few things about this document. Now, it is rather short. I do recommend reading it. There is a link in this Climate of Fear article to its to online version of this. And it is, if you don't have, let's say, education in philosophy or maybe sociology, you can have problems picking up the right details, but where you see what it is all about. But I think that nevertheless it should be read because it is the foundational document of the mindset about which I'm talking about now. We'll just quote something from this document. The document was written by the Club of Rome in the hopes that humans will finally construct the global, world-encompassing system of managing the world in the political, economical, and scientific sense. And they claim that in order to do this, humankind should unite over the single issue, that is, not particular issues as was traditionally done. For instance, that you have for instance, some political crisis, clash of two countries, and then you call this regional problems, and those countries are trying to solve it, or UN jumps in, helps them try to solve it. No, no. This should be something else. This should be a problem that is the threat to all mankind. Now, note one thing. I will not go in depth, we don't have time now in this document. I will just give you an outline. They don't say that humanity has a problem that is global, but they say that humanity should have a problem. And now what they do, they try to invent it. To be more precise, they try to provide the outlines how this problem should look like. And this problem should be modeled. It should be a model of the world. And to jump ahead a bit, they decided upon this resource scarcity at that time, because this document was a model framework for limits of growth study, which was in fact an interpretation of mathematical model made by American system theorist J. Forrester, and that was an attempt to predict how the world will look like in the future. And they of course predicted, Dennis Meadows was the author and his wife, they predicted a complete depletion of some resources as zinc, aluminium and so on, famine and so on and so forth. Of course, none of those predictions came to pass. Something very similar to this climate change scare, because in terms of global warming, because it originally was global warming, the reason why they call it climate change is because warming is global warming became dubious even to laymen. The same thing was done, so they made predictions, and those predictions were failures. At least those predictions that were widely circulated in public, and now they are trying to worm their way out of it. Now this document, I think, demonstrate that this global problem is an invention, and that it can be something completely different. It's my opinion that you can make, for instance, global terrorism or threat of alien invasion the same thing. And now we'll see why. I quote, "The primary aim of modeling is to give the subject a shape, a structure, a configuration that is determined by an objective, which itself is external to the subject. Hence the clarifications or insights that might be obtained from a successful modeling effort are never reached in terms of the subject, i.e., a problem or a situation, but in terms of external objective, to satisfy which the modeling was undertaken in the first place." Now this is a mouthful, but I'll tell you what they mean. They are saying that subject, that is the system of knowledge, for instance, is structured according to objective, that is the meaning or purpose why it exists, and that the form of this system, the model of it, must be shaped by its external objective, not by objective reality, but the objective, the aim why it was constructed in the first place. So this means, and this they call a value base. They say such an objective always entails a value, and the setting of it must therefore create a particular value base that gives meaning and direction to the whole endeavor. They want to imagine, and I stress the word imagine, the image of the world. They want to make it up, because system theory is based on making things up, in trying to model the world in our heads as a system. And in order to do this, we must give it some boundaries and value base. And value base for them was to keep ecological balance, whatever the hell that is. They always have these vague expressions. And this ecological balance would be kind of solution to the world problem, which is world scarcity. And then they developed this after 1972 Stockholm Conference, UN Environmental Summit. They started to turn this into sustainable, what is now called sustainable development. The word was applied by Gro Harlem Brundtland in 1986. So that is more than 10 years after this environmental conference, but the thing remained, the purpose remained the same. There was to be imagined a world problem that will give a world shape, that will give a shape to our overall notion of the world. And this problem is, I think, in the last instance, overpopulation, because this is the one thing they always stress. That is, it's either ecological crisis or whether it be scarcity, global warming, global cooling, global this or global that. But this population problem, the idea that Earth is too small for too many people, which is something completely unproven, and I would go as far to say unprovable, they keep this. And this is something that can give you an illusion of scientific basis, but there is no scientific basis. What is clear from this convoluted passage and from some others down the line is that the value base that construct this world system is a subjective thing. It is an act of invention. So this is, I think, where, for instance, sustainable development had its inception. Now, to connect sustainable development with GMOs and other things, well, it does seem logical, but I would not go so far. I'm not doing these connecting of dots. I'm more interested in single dots and the depths that are hidden behind those dots. Not in connections, in relations. That's what conspiracy theories does. This is not a conspiracy, stricto sensu. It is a policy that is enshrined, for instance, in Lisbon Treaty, the Constitution of European Union, and it is widely promoted, although I would say not really very successful, because this is one superficial model of globalism, of kind of that entails even a kind of global environmentalist religion and so on and so forth, and this does not fly very good when you contrast it to reality and to how people really think and feel. So just to mention one more thing, you asking me, you say you are very amusing dismantling work of others, but I would like to know more of your own theory of the world. I can answer this straightforwardly. I don't have my own theory of the world. I don't think that theory of the world as something single, unified, can be given and can be made. Indeed, I don't think the attempt should be made, and this narration I just had about this Club of Rome document serves partly to demonstrate this, because what they try to do is to have this world image, to construct the world image, and then, which is completely logical, they try to impose it upon others. I don't think that this theory of everything is possible. I think that one of the maladies that are manifested in this craze about conspiracy theories comes precisely because people feel an urge to construct these theories. I don't think they are possible. I think it's possible to know a lot, and to know a lot on the grounds of world having eternal and unchangeable and let's say supra-rational principles, but I don't think they can be demonstrated, that they can be known in totality. You can't have a system of the world, because theory of the world will be a world system, and then you would end up with this. And this is the problem with these conspiracy theorists, because they are very similar, if not congenial, with the people that they are supposedly fighting for. They want the same thing, rule the world. Because there are many ways to have the power over the world. One of those is to know it all, which is of course impossible, but it can be a tendency, and this tendency is something you have in sustainable development, in documents like Agenda 21 and so on, and those UN policies, but you have it in people like, for instance, David Icke and these conspiracy theories who connect the dots and claim that they answered the riddle of history. They tell you that they are explaining history from the days of ancient Babylon and so on, which is completely idiotic. Anybody who ever studied history knows that you just can't reduce it to those simple two-dimensional dots you connect with lines, and then you draw kind of two-dimensional image. That's an illusion, a mirage. So that would be my answer to you, Karlov. I presume Boris is a first name. Hope it was to your satisfaction. And now we'll continue to another question, another comment, which is terrifyingly long, but is interesting and really deserves attention. And just a second, please. Come on. Aide. Oh, slow computer, I'm sorry. Okay. Now this will be a comment by our old acquaintance Han Fei, man who writes comments bigger than articles under which he writes them. And I do like when he does that, because those comments can be very inspiring. And this is one of them, and we'll try to skip some things, although it does deserve to be quoted totally. Now, Han Fei says, I have to offer a few words of criticism. You never have to criticize, Han Fei, but okay. Not of this issue specifically, but the entire angle that you seem to be taking here. I have voiced these objections before, but perhaps not with regards to the truth that we are trying to establish here. Keep in mind that I am not necessarily against your position. Rather, I feel my criticism would be necessary to anticipate the charges that will be made against you by others. Mind you, it is not so much related. I'm not telling you about which article is this or podcast, because this is generally about Kali Tribune. That you partake in the mentality of small nationhood, or that you are at the end of the day partial to the geopolitical bloc, which historically served as the benefactors and protectors of said nationhood. Now, I don't really believe that to affect the value of your arguments, even if it were true, I simply don't care. I too am a member of a small, highly dependent nation, and this gives me a negative perspective of so-called great power chauvinism. Okay, this is something that one should always be careful about, because those who follow Kali Tribune know that I'm very partial about this problematic of war in Yugoslavia on the one hand, and I'm preparing to do as thorough as possible exposition of the history of the war in the aftermath of the dissolution of that ill-fated country, and that I kind of get the stance, this small country perspective, trying to take some kind of distance to look, how should I put it, with critical eye on those great powers and geopolitics in general and so on and so forth, especially Russians, because there is a lot of criticism on Kali Tribune of Russian media influence in alternative media. I would take this opportunity just to note that I don't consider Kali Tribune to be alternative media at all. I think that alternative media is a phenomenon worthy of government censorship, and I'm not kidding when I'm saying this. I will not elaborate now about on this, but I am more and more of this opinion. I consider alt media to be highly negative phenomenon, with Russians or without Russians. So this is what Han Fei is warning me about. It's a good warning, but I don't think this will happen to me. Now let us go deeper into his argument. The first point of criticism to which I will latch on is your understanding of globalism in the plural sense. Now this is important, by which you seem to imply some kind of categorization between them. No, there is only one globalism. Han Fei, like me, likes to assert something absolutely. I love doing this. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that it's not true. Just as there is one globe. Okay, let's see. Where will this take us? The illusion of particularity stems from the different vectors that strive towards it. This distinction is not trivial when we consider the fact that the so-called Russian narrative is far too incipient to simply be the product of the Kremlin-backed troll factories, as the deluded emigres that American mass media hires in droves seem to think. Well, as those who follow Kali Tribune know, when it comes to globalisms, I can't agree with this. I can agree to this in some kind of metaphysical sense, that all globalists, all people who want to unite and rule the world, are in fact of one mind. But to say that there is only, for instance, this Western-based globalism, or globalism that is univocal in Russia, America, and so on and so everywhere as some kind of kitten candy, I'm sorry, this is simply not true. It flies in the face of facts. Dugin, of which I wrote so much, is a globalist, but he is a globalist that is diametrically opposed to American, for instance, or UN globalists. We just talked about sustainable development. You can talk about, for instance, open society, which is pushed by, I would say, most of these developed countries, Western governments, and among others by George Soros, who is now the boogeyman for everybody, although he's not that important in my opinion. He was the boogeyman in my country in the early 90s, so I know this from experience. So, for instance, when Dugin, I will not quote Dugin again, but when he says that he wants the global empire with the base laid in the Eurasian heartland and run by people of Russian ethnicity, and call it global rule of the Russian people, he is different globalist than one that say that, as a Club of Rome would say, or UN, that should be run by global governance, by this system, impersonal system of sustainable development. I'm afraid this is a case closed for me. This This simply is not true. There are different globalisms. There are different aspiration to global empire. And those global empires are imagined in a different way, although they kind of mirror each other. This is very interesting, especially in the case of Dugin. We continue. Next, in terms of the alt media, what do we mean when we talk about the Russian narrative? The Russian narrative is primarily distinguished in that it is a geopolitical narrative, true. It doesn't concern itself with assuming an ethical position or orientation, but rather views the unfolding of events in terms of collective blocks of nations and their geopolitical interests. By doing so, it claims to be free from ideological bias to the moral superiority of the Western civilization, a crucial point of reference in mainstream media. Yeah. When you remove this essential feature, it's not hard to point out the double standards taken by the Anglosphere, press and politicians. So what do I mean? Let's take the situation in Syria. The geopolitical discussion will hinge on a seemingly very convincing point. That it is essentially a proxy war between Israel, KSA, and Iran over influence, oil, etc. Since Saudi-Israel is in control of Congress and much of the American political elite by definition, it is America's war as well. Assad is trying to use every means at his disposal to secure control over the country, and because he possesses the most potent military force in the region, consequently, he holds the largest possibility of achieving an end to this conflict. The Russian intervention is justified on these grounds. This is the Russian narrative. It is not necessarily incorrect, but notice several things missing from it. First, there is no discussion of the internal social dynamics leading up to the breakout of violence and which could play a separate role that is no less crucial than the great game, so-called, between outside powers. Even when there is, it's usually reduced to, just like in Ukraine, the meddling of Western intelligence services. This is very insightful remark. And this is something I am constantly trying to force upon people who still believe in this alt media and conspiratorial worldview. Inner dynamics. Those so-called narratives are imaginary because they just ditch out of the window any kind of reality, in fact, reality of those countries. And this is why I'll do this series on war in Yugoslavia, because I was there. Unfortunately, I'm still here, fortunately or unfortunately, and I know a bit about this. And when I saw in those alt media outlets that some of them been around from the 90s, even before internet, when I saw what they write about war in Yugoslavia, I was astonished how crazy it is, frankly, because they are using it. They are using it to prove their own theories about world in general, and so on and so forth. Usually fundamentalist leftist, where they try to prove that everything is just a clash of classes and imperialist capitalist countries destroying, for instance, Yugoslavia, and so on and so forth, which has got little or nothing to do with the truth, and which excludes internal factors. That is, people who actually waged that war, suffered in that war, tried to escape from that war. They don't figure in the picture at all. And this is what happens with these teary-eyed friends of Syria, also on alternative media. This is what they do. Now we'll continue. Not a word about the extent, the nature of the civilian suffering, nor the perpetrators responsible for it, if they are not Western intelligence services, of course. Sure, Geopoliticians of either stripe may decry the violence, but they penned it entirely in terms of the realpolitik discussions held above. For example, when we are talking about ISIS American atrocities, a mask of terrible outrage tends to be eagerly assumed, but when the discussion reaches the atrocities of the Syrian regime, the assumption holds that it was practically inconceivable for Assad to conduct the war in any other way. Oh, but what can you do? You can't make an omelette without breaking some, in our case, lots and lots of eggs. This is crucial, essential, critical, central, and I should say absolute facility of the so-called geopolitical narrative. And I, if I may interject in Humphrey narrative, narration, heartily agree. And this is really, and I would put this emphasis to, this is main thing about this, main thing about geopolitical narrative. The human side, that is to say, the moral side of the event, is entirely irrelevant unless it is subject to the factor involved in a great power's decision-making process. And this is why I'm pissed off at this alt media, because they mask their coldness, those people, global research, even 21, where Patrick Henningsen is not like that, because I know the man personally, but he's got a lot of accomplices on the side that are of this mold. All those humanity is nothing, it's just proving their worldviews, their attempts to have what Karlov asked me, do I have theory of the world? So I noticed this because I saw that they tried, for instance, some of them tried to explain war in Yugoslavia on the principle of what they see to be war in Syria, and came to conclusion that it's the same thing. It not only is it is not the same thing. It's got nothing to. It's very hard to even draw analogies, for Christ's sakes. And that was completely different world. Yugoslavia fell, dissolved at the very end of Cold War. It started dissolving. It started, I'd say, that first signs of that it is on the point. It is at the point of no return was in 1987 with rise of Slobodan Milosevic. We'll have an opportunity to go into this in depth, but it was completely different process. European Union was not yet Union; it was European Community. It was very very divided about how to react to Yugoslavia. Soviet Union was still a Soviet Union, which was most important thing to have in mind when Yugoslavia is concerned, and American relation towards Gorbachev, and so on. And this is something completely different. And those people are using Syrian, for instance, let's say suffering of Syrians, not because they are compassionate, but because they want to push their narratives. And they can fool themselves into thinking that they are compassionate, but they are not. This geopolitical aspect is a trademark of Russian media. And this is something that was to a certain extent imposed and infused into alt media that were already existing before the time the Russians started co-opting it in a way, I'd say, from 2008 onwards. Let's continue. It's as if what is unfolding is a fucking video game. Yes, that's it. But in reality, it's precisely the human side that is the most important facet of the conflict, I agree. And until the nations of the world understand this, there can be no talk about humanitarian resolution to such conflicts. So yeah, I think we can agree on this, yes we can, but this is not yet the point on which my argument hinges. Okay, there are many points here. Do you not see how this narrative, as I tried to so exhaustively argue in my previous ramblings, cannot be mere propaganda of the Kremlin? Given the light of the facts presented above, the prefix Russian is entirely unnecessary, because the existence of such a geopolitical power as Russia is entirely irrelevant to the existence of such narrative. Russia, in this sense, only exists as a potential competitor to the vector of globalism taken by the West, as is China, as is India or Europe. Potential competitor to the vector of globalism. But this means that it is globalist itself. Because, I mean, okay, but let's not go nitpicking. Let's look at globalism's favorite little chow toy, the United Nations. If we count as to how many countries in the world adopt a position that seems to be in line with that of the Russian government, then we would be led to the conclusion that, for example, Latin America is Russian. Definitely, Africa is Russian. Not to speak of China, India, a sizable part of the Muslim world, and what seems to be in the near future highly likely as well, Japan. Now, we'll stop here for a moment. Hanfei. Now think what you said. What you described here is the wrong side of the Huntington's formula, Samuel Huntington's formula, West against the rest. You describe the rest and one member that is not yet rest, but people like Dugin would like to see him there, because Dugin looks at Japan as Eurasian power, because what Dugin and new rightists and post-Nazis and all those people pushing this geopolitical idea want is reiterate Second World War, to have a new world order that will be ordered as if Axis won the war. Namely, what Dugin, who is a globalist, wants is precisely this. These are Eurasian, this is multipolar world, to unite the rest against the West. And, among other things, to put Japan there, because everything relies upon Axis Berlin, Moscow, Tokyo. Some kind of triple pact of our postmodern age, reiteration of that pact that existed in Second World War between Italy, Germany and Japan, now between Russia, Germany and Japan. And the leadership would be Russia. This is the model, you just sketched one model of globalization that is not Western. I would go so far as to argue that there is even some, let's say, hidden hand, that there is something behind both and all players. I am open to discuss those things, but as you know, evidence are very scarce, and this is something that little old me between this computer screen is, well, I don't think very much qualified to discover. You have to be, I think, a bit higher in these corridors of power in diplomacy or high-class journalism to personally know some big players to kind of get a glimpse of this. But putting that put aside, this is a sketch of Eurasian Empire, and believe me, as far as I know, UN is not pushing this. Dugin is pushing this. Russia is not really pushing this as much as he would want to, but from somewhere, I think around 2005 or so, Dugin, I'm sorry, Putin appropriated this Eurasianist terminology, not so much Dugin's as much as classical Eurasianists, but he got close to this way of thinking on Dugin's own admission. We continue. As for the extent of their influence, the traditional European power brokers are losing ground by the heaps. They know it. And in near future they will be forced to act according to this reality. It's America that seems to be solely at odds out with regards to, let's just call it, the narrative. The election of Cheeto Brain only helped to solidify the external alienation of the world's opinion from the interests, purposes, and the narratives of Washington. Yeah. But to attribute this to the success to any part of the Russian political apparatus is absurd. If the globalist institution like the UN seems to be wholeheartedly accepting Russia's stance at this point, then what can be said about the particularity of said narrative towards its goals in Russia? Is it not more likely that out of the possible competitors itching for the proverbial throne of the world, it seems that a hand is being reached out to, or rather perhaps grabbing, Russia rather than the other way around? This is something I will not comment, I will just think about it, because it is very thought-provoking, but I am not so sure how to answer it. I would have to think about it. But this I will answer. What is, strictly speaking, so different about Dugin from, say, Brzezinski, Schwartz, or if we look further back into history, people like Mazzini, of whom you wrote and spoke at length? Their language is different, but their goal is the same. If you want to shield yourself from any accusation of partiality, even in grace of your Latin faith, I sincerely hope that you will address what I'm saying here, and I am just doing this, as you see. Doing it, and I agree 100%. And maybe I'm going, maybe I'm not clear enough, or maybe I went too far in this Dugin bashing and analysis of Russian influence in media. But I did say, for instance, had put a parallel, for instance, between Dugin and Brzezinski. And I would include Mazzini definitely here. I agree 100%. So this is the very congenial, if not the same, identical mentality. And we have secret societies, especially in the case of Mazzini, who operated in the 19th century in the heyday of secret societies and so forth. Their language is different, but their goal is the same. I agree. But I am not so sure that we could say that there is only one globalism. I think they have different ideas about how the world should look like, because I have articles on Brzezinski, especially on the mindset of Brzezinski, which I find appalling, which you can find in his book Between Two Ages, America in Technotronic Age. This is this geopolitical, that is to say, positivist idea of the world, and falsifying of history, reducing it to completely materialist principles which are in fact in existence, simplifying it into oblivion. Dugin does the same with geopolitics. I agree 100%. So this is not problematic for me. Only I don't see the point of bashing Brzezinski's idea, and because it is so much is written about Brzezinski, but not so much about Dugin. And Brzezinski doesn't care what I say. Dugin could care, because Dugin is influencing the fringe, and I am unfortunately acting on a fringe, and he's closer to me and I am closer to him. Brzezinski, God rest his soul, oh, I forgot he died. This is a completely different kind of player in a sense of power he has, and he's elite by birth. But I would agree that this is completely the same mentality, essentially congenial mentality, and in this I do agree. So that would be my comment on your comment, Hanfei, and your comment, Karlov, presumably Boris. And in the light of my Latin faith, after I discussed what you discussed with me, answered your questions and answer to your objections, I think it's fitting to end this video with that famous Latin saying, Roma locuta, causa finita. Thank you for your attention. This is Branko Malic, and to quote Sigourney Weaver in Alien, signing out.